Great. Okay, so I think we'll get started. I am just very, very pleased to invite Ameer, Shaheed onto the conversation series tonight. My name is Lee Biddlecombe. Those of you that haven't seen me or met me before, I work at Perspectiva, mainly in an editorial capacity, but also curating events and helping to moderate. And I will just get started and introduce Ameer. So as many of you might have noticed from the event title, he's going to be speaking about the hemispheric hypothesis in the context of global development. And Ameer himself is a transdisciplinary member of the international development world. He's a scientist, he's a development consultant, and he's also an artist. And so I think when you see and hear those three things, you'll see how this all fits in together with Iain's work very beautifully. He's working increasingly along the intersection of those three areas. His academic background is in environmental public health with a focus on water and sanitation. And recently he's been working on the ways in which water, health, and peace building can all engage with arts and culture. He's worked across academia and NGOs and multilateral institutions across many various places in the world. And he is currently in Geneva. And you were also born and raised there, is that right, Ameer? Okay. So I will just allow the two of them to enter into a conversation. I believe Ameer taking the lead here. So thank you very much, and looking forward to coming back for the Q&A.
Well, hello, Ameer again. I should explain to people that I was lucky enough to be in Switzerland in the last month, first in Basel and then in Geneva. And in Geneva, Ameer was graciously hosting me, and I spoke at the Graduate Institute of the University of Geneva and at a location in CERN, their Idea Square. And we had plenty of time to talk together. And I immediately realized that here was somebody who was invaluable to this discussion, because he was if you like, a polymathic person, a scientist, an artist, and also involved in the world of governmental organizations. And that's a perspective that we hadn't really had. And as we talked, it became clear to me that there was a lot that we could further discuss. And I think we both felt that when I had to leave Switzerland, that was not the end of the conversation. So let's take it from there, Ameer. Perhaps you could first say how you came across my work and what relevance it seemed to you to have to your work in the arena of public health, at WHO and WHO, and working on water, particularly water sanitation and provision.
Great, thank you, Iain, and thank you all for being here. It's such an honor and a real pleasure. Yeah, I remember distinctly the moment I came across your work. It was in the deepest, darkest days of my PhD, and I was struggling with making sense, I think, of my experience, where I found a difference between what I was hoping to have learned and hoping to be able to do, and what I found myself really doing. And I came across it. I was in the middle of analyzing my data from one of my field sites, and once I hit play on one of the videos, I had to go through everything that was available. This was 10 years ago, so there wasn't a lot at the time, but it made so much sense to me, because I think my entry into international development, which was through public health and water and sanitation, was seeded by a very human and developmental question, which was essentially fed by my own experience of growing up between these two very different places, one being Geneva, Switzerland, one of the sort of wealthiest places in the world, and the other being Pakistan, Karachi, you know. And I wanted to understand what I could do to help address some of these disparities and these inequalities and some of these complex challenges. I initially thought it was going to be primarily through learning very hard tools, because I thought this is the best way to solve these problems. It's very pointed solutions that I need, and hard methods. And the more I went down the rabbit hole of trying to understand these problems, right? Whether you look at water and sanitation in Karachi, or even before that, you get to the infectious diseases that are affecting people in Karachi. And then you go underneath it. It's the environment which is underneath that. And then you go, okay, well, the environment is that way because there's a certain system or an impoverishment of the system in place, which then brings you down to poverty, which brings you down to these broad narratives. And I wasn't seeing those bits being connected. And then when I actually got into the business of writing, or of doing my own research, I was struck by how limited my knowledge was about the problem spaces and how limited my ability to address them was. So we learned all these technical solutions in university. And when I came to Pakistan, which was one of my field sites, and Zambia, I was struck by my inability to answer a lot of the questions that people would ask me. And my solutions made a lot of sense to me based on my rational mind and based on what I'd learned with a very sort of westernized sort of perspective, without understanding the real context in Zambia or in Pakistan. I was struck by how people over there who understood the context of the place often had much, much better solutions. I was struck by the difference between when we say that you have, well, actually, just touching on context, my first field site was in Zambia, where collecting the data and making it very good, making it very clean is extremely important. So as long as it's double entered, and as long as, you know, we've made sure that people have put a 1 where they're supposed to put a 1 and a 2 where they're supposed to put a 2, everything makes sense. But
yes.
One of my teachers said, you know, think about how tired the people you're speaking to are when you're asking them the questions. You can have the cleanest data in the world, and if you've given them a barrage of questions, they're probably just going to be answering randomly or in a way that's very biased. I would instill in my teams the importance of building trust with these communities, because they said, and these were teams of people who spent a lot of time working on, every 6 months it was a new project. Sometimes it would be with this NGO or that NGO, and they were in the habit of kind of barking orders and asking for questions from people, as long as they could fill their questionnaires. What mattered to them was getting X number of questionnaires done a day. And I'd be like, but it doesn't mean anything if these people are giving us biased answers. Go to the community first. Let's spend some time. Let's get to know people. Let's build trust. Now let's. And so there was this, and then one of the people that I spoke to in Zambia, where as soon as I mentioned the site I was working in, said, you know, oh, that site, that's where all the NGOs go. And so they're like, every week there's a new group of people that come and ask them questions. You know, people are incentivized to say, oh, are you the water guys? We need good water. Are you the HIV guys? Oh, we have terrible HIV over here. Whatever it is that you need, because we know that ultimately, you know, you want to help us, and something good will come out of it. But so there was this huge disparity between what made sense to us coming down, made sense on my paper, what made sense in my regression models, and what the truth was. That was one part. And then the other part was, I think, and I'll stop there to see what you think. But the other part was one of my formative experiences in public health was going to Pakistan and working at the Aga Khan University and with a local university called NED. And I was brought into contact with with people who've worked on the Orangi pilot project, which is a very well-known project in development circles, because it was one of the first participatory models. And essentially what I noticed was a difference between what I was doing on some of my projects, which was very, I think, standard models of development at the time, where we were spending enormous amounts of money, not really interacting much with communities, and my experience with the Orangi pilot project, which was a famous case in the 80s, where Akhtar Hamid Khan, who's one of the fathers of microfinance, actually moved to Pakistan as an older gentleman and wanted to help the squatter settlement. It was the biggest squatter settlement in Asia at the time. Now, he learned that one of the large world's multilaterals had tens of millions of dollars to spend to fix the sanitation system in the squatter community. And the government was very keen at the time because there was a lot of money coming in, and the decision makers figured a lot of money means a lot of impact. And he said, but when he looked at the methods of how they were going to work, he said, you're not speaking to anyone in this community. You're not working with anyone over here. And you think you can do it in about 9 months. I'm seeing this settlement as being a place which is really not going to be able to get that sort of outcome in the time and with the methods that you're employing. He decided, instead of following this model, to go and live in this community first for like a year. Ooh. And he worked as a local blacksmith, just getting to know everyone in the community. He established relationships with everyone that was there. Then he made a counter proposal to the government, which was going to use a fifth of the money. It was going to take longer, and it was going to be working with everyone that was there, using local pipes, local material, local building knowledge. And ultimately they rejected it because they said, no, we want to go with this large organization. They're going to bring people from another country. They're going to bring materials from a third place, and it's going to be amazing. So he said, okay. He let them start in one part of the community, and he went to the opposite end and rallied everyone in the community to give their own money. They had very little. He said, this is your problem. I'm going to work with you to solve this. And he essentially got them all to pitch in a few rupees. And after 6 months, the large project ran out of funds, had covered 1 out of 32 neighborhoods. And meanwhile, he'd covered 50% of the whole community, with all this local knowledge. That project then became known as the Orangi pilot project. He said, what I like about the term pilot project is that it's constantly changing, evolving, constantly studying its situation. It's never an established thing. And also, it's not going to be a model that we can take and scale up and just dump in another part of the world. And it remains to this day as the Orangi pilot. And so a lot of these things sort of resonated with me when I came across your work.
Oh, that's wonderful. And I remember you telling me that story, and I just love to hear it again. It's so symptomatic of so many things, you know, the neglect of context, the need to understand how somebody really answers a question and what they understand first, and then what they mean to be saying. There's a wonderful work, which I quote in The Matter with Things, called "The Data Are Lousy, but They're All We've Got." And I can't remember now the author of the book. I think it's somebody like Robert Chambers. But anyway, he pointed out that, of course, it should be obvious that if the data are lousy, they're worse than not having any data at all, because they will lead you astray. And yet the whole system is designed around having results that are numeric, that are measured, and so forth. And he has a hilarious thing on how this data is gathered. And at the end of it, he says, always assuming that these boxes were not actually filled in the relative cool of a cafe sitting over a drink, which was much easier than actually going around and asking people. So there are all these problems. Some of them are to do with context. Some of them are to do with the way in which we understand another person's mind. Some of them are, all of these very much important right hemisphere issues. Some of it is to do with the need to show that something is happening even when actually it can't be measured. And the bits that are measured are almost irrelevant compared with the things that can not be measured. And so it's wonderful to start already with kind of, I'm going to live here and get to know people and get them to trust me. That is utterly brilliant. And so I just see loads of things coming up well, while you were talking that just mirror back to one, this problem that you can take a solution and roll it out, as we now say in this hideous phrase, somewhere else. This is the language of large, powerful bureaucracies that think that one size fits all. And at the end of the Greek civilization, and even more at the end of the Roman civilization, this was what was happening. And this is what we're doing now. Mm-hmm. Yes. I remember I think it was you telling me about a Japanese initiative, which was very well intentioned. People came in and in a very short space of time, a matter of weeks, they'd installed some kind of water purification plant. And already after a week, it broke down because they hadn't thought to explain to anybody actually there what they needed to do to keep it maintained, that it needed certain things to be put into it once a week. But they didn't have those things and they didn't know where to get those things. And so you come down to this idea that it's brilliant to have lots of money come in, do a quick job and go out. I think that's one of the other points I'd like to raise, is that it's so rarely the case that the quick job is the best job. Most important problems are better solved by being more patient, taking more time, and producing a lasting solution. Anyway.
Yes, completely.
There we are.
I think those are two other things that have really struck me in terms of what is good development work. It is usually very contextual. It is usually very time-consuming. This is one of the resources that is the hardest for us to spend. We have, and again, I say all of this as a member of this world of international development. There's a lot of intentions in it. There's a lot of good work that's also done. But it's important for us, I think, self-critical and to see where it is that we can improve. And the time thing is really key, as is the process aspect. So it's because it's obviously, if we're looking at the means of a lot of any institution, it doesn't even have to be international development. The means of institutions today are dictated by funding cycles, by time, efficiency, and in many ways there's this managementization of all of our institutions, and development is one of them, as probably all of them really today. And so what that puts as the preeminence is given to efficiency, to minimizing time, maximizing quantitative output. And there's less time spent on processes as a result. So that example I was telling you about was in a village where I was actually looking at one of the worst ways of treating water really the least sustainable is emergency water treatment. It's not meant to be used all the time by definition. And so we were looking at places that really needed it. And so we assumed, this village had been hit by floods, they'd had cholera epidemics, they'd had lots of issues. And so it was very surprising to me after a few days of visiting the village to find a perfectly, good water treatment system at the back of the village, in which cows were sort of drinking the green algae water on top. And that was when they said, a very well-meaning, institution came, built this wonderful system, but nobody spent any time training the human system that was required and making sure that that process was in place. Yeah, and I guess yeah.
No, I love the thing you said about a pilot study, that because in a way, if you come to think about it, every study is a pilot study because it's coming from somewhere and leading on somewhere afterwards. It's never an end in itself, and it's never now the fossilized model that we will always be using. It's another step on a process that, I'm sorry, I always say this, but that is one of a flow in which things, as it were, come to where they are and then move on. And a pilot is exactly what you need when you're in that flow. So I like that. And I think it's the opposite of what happens so often. I mean, you've talked about several ways in which things become static, become fixed, become fossilized, become ponderous, become inflexible, unable really to respond to the particularity of the situation. Once again, the right hemisphere sees the particularity of whatever it is beholding, whereas the left hemisphere sees only another example of. But in life, there are never just another example of.
Yes, yes. This is another really important facet to development, and that we need to be very mindful of, I think, is this essential aspect of context and not being so focused on scaling everything up in a certain way. Obviously, we would like to expand development, well-being, health, peace. That's a noble pursuit, but if you try and do it in this cookie cutter way, you'll get the opposite often, and you'll end up having a lot of wastage going on in terms of the resource, the very valuable resources that you're putting in. This is often a question that at least you used to see in applications for grants was, tell us about this very beautiful community project, and now tell us how you're going to scale it up to 6 million places in 10 months. And it's like, well, we can't. But then people have to people find themselves in a situation where, because that's what the system is requiring, they then have to design their intervention in order to do that. Otherwise, they won't get. And again, I think this is where we have to really ask ourselves about what is guiding. You mentioned the word pilot project. And I think the key aspect to a pilot is the guidance and navigation and how they navigate, which implies a good map amongst other things. And so our systems really have to question what is guiding it, and often it is often boiling down to a question of funding efficiency, how you're going to get more funds the next year to do something. And so you're always running after this thing which fits a private sector corporate company's model, but not when the outcome is something which is inherently a process and inherently qualitative, not quantitative.
Yes. And I suspect that many of the cases that are taken from, as you say, global capitalism, would be a lot better if they weren't of this one-size-fits-all thing. I think there are two resonances here for me. One is that quantity is already a quality, that when you change the quantity of anything, you change its nature, sometimes radically. And the other is that we are talking about systems, and we're talking really about what are not just complicated systems, but complex systems. They are human, natural, organic systems in which there are masses of different factors playing a part, interacting with one another, and producing internal loops of causation, which are not the same as what you see when you focus in on some very small part of it and identify a mechanism. The thing about mechanisms and mechanistic visions of a system is that they're not entirely wrong. If only they were entirely wrong, it would be easy to dismiss them. But the reality is that they have a kind of use at a certain level. Their point is utility, but when you actually try to understand the whole, you go wrong as soon as you try to pan back and see this as just a complicated system. It isn't. It's a living, complex system. And the rules for understanding those are entirely different. So you constantly get this problem that the scale enters into it. People are forced to do something that intuitively they know is wrong, but they won't get the grant unless they do the thing that's wrong. And this is endemic in our society. I mean, I've told this before, but I like it very much. It's just amusing. And, you know, in a process whereby I gave a lecture at Oxford, I was pleased to discover that the university was going to pay me an honorarium that I hadn't expected, a very nice one. And in the old days, having received this news, a few days later, a cheque would have arrived in the post from the university chest. But I spent 6 months online trying to find out how to get this money. There were very, very complex systems with various stages and platforms and modules I had to go through. And it really was ridiculous. And in the end, it came down to a form that had 77 possibilities in it. I had to tick one of the boxes to say what service I had supplied to the university. Now, it turned out that if I had been offering window cleaning or catering, it would have been straightforward. But since what I'd actually offered was something that I thought was the whole purpose of a university, which was to give a talk, there wasn't a box. So eventually I sort of thought, I'm going to ring up the university chest. And I was delighted to find that I spoke to a real person, gold dust, so unusual these days. And this person was so sympathetic because she said, oh, tell me about it. It's a nightmare. There is no way of working it accurately. The only thing to do is to put in something else completely. We'll ignore it and pay you. And that's exactly what happened. So everybody is caught up in this. I think the point is worth making, because it's not that, as it were, as sometimes people think, there's a sort of marvelously efficient mechanistic bureaucracy that's in control. These bureaucracies are actually highly inefficient. They're very wasteful of resources, and they actually control the people who themselves are serving it or trying to administer it. Nobody is beyond it. And I fear that, you know, let's not go straight to AI, but if we were to, I fear that in the end, even those people who stand to become even more obscenely rich than they already are by exploiting AI will find themselves embroiled in it and incapable of actually escaping it. It has a power of its own. There's a kind of drive in this left hemisphere administrative artificial intelligence world, which is bigger than anybody, and it's got a little momentum of its own, seeking power. Don't know what you'd say about that. May sound completely bonkers to you.
Well, so it's a tangential topic to the one that we said we'd talk about. But one of the things I've actually wanted to speak to you about was this, and there's a term that I've come across that I find really interesting called Agrigors. I don't know if you're familiar with this.
No.
It comes from like medieval magic histories, but essentially it speaks to the emergent idea, like a living idea that is created when several people come together. Whether it's a family, whether it's in an institution, whether it's in and there's this sense when you join, you know, a new company that you yourself start to kind of change and get molded by something larger. Like you say, I think people outside any institution will often see it as sort of either being orchestrated by a group of people who are completely, you know, sort of with this particularly coherent vision and who completely abide by its own rules. But as you say, it's often very normal people like you and me who are themselves a little bit like, well, you know, I might not, I don't see eye to eye with this, but, you know, I'm doing I'm just doing my little part in it.
Yes.
But ultimately there's a bigger, there's a momentum which is bigger than all of them, which is, I think this concept of Agrigors speaks about this sort of at many emergent levels. Like, as a society today, there's a certain archetype in the air, which has been fed by everything we've been putting into it, and these things have a life of their own, which are bigger than all of the parts. And I think a lot of what people see in trends and movements and institutions, or in governments, or in the entire society, is happening really at that level, as opposed to in any of the parts. And this obviously speaks a lot to, you know, your work in terms of parts and wholes. But I found this very powerful, and also something which kind of gives you hope in terms of how do you change things, is be the thoughts and ideas that are going in a direction that you deem to be better, right? I think a lot of people ask you, you know, this question, which is very output focused, like, what do we do? You know, give us the 5, you know, lists, points of what we need to change the world. And I think they often end up frustrated, because the answer is often one that's much more process oriented, a much more oriented towards, well, orientation. How do you create a nurturing environment for the change that you want, and how do you shift it? To me,
let me say, sorry, carry on, Ameer.
Oh, no, it was just, yeah, like, to me, all of this, if we look at this aspect of emergent sort of ideas, as almost sort of this separate thing, then what you're talking about makes a lot of sense, because it is precisely in changing this howness that you will actually feed and change the emergent whole of a system, of an institution, of a country, of a world.
Yes. Well, there's an enigma here, isn't there? Which again has something to do with size. And one way in which we can resist is through size, but paradoxically, not through large size, but precisely through small size. Talk about your organization that you join. If it is really 3 or 4 people, barely more than that, then each maintains this very important balance between their individuality and their belonging to the group, this unity of division and union that I always talk about. And very small groups like this can be massively creative. And in science, it has almost always not been enormously prestigious and billion-funded research groups consisting of hundreds, even thousands of workers that have really done the science-changing work. It has often been one person, 2, 3, or 4 people, but enough to be able to share a few ideas, and they produce these moments that Thomas Kuhn referred to as the paradigm shifts. The difficulty, though, is that when you're only a small group, how do you find the leverage? How do you find the power to, you can convince by ideas and so forth, and perhaps you can be very powerful like that. I mean, I'd like to think that, you know, just by talking about what I've been researching for 30 years, I have changed a lot of minds, even though there's only, me and a handful of other people who are doing this work. So perhaps that is possible. I don't know, but I would love your thoughts, because, I mean, obviously the way in which we think we can alter things is to band together on a world scale. And that's what, WHO and other government organizations are all about. But they bring with them their own problems. How do we finesse that?
Yeah, 100%. This is something that I was also hoping that we'd be able to talk about, the size and scale, local versus global. To me,
yeah.
and this is known in development and in academia, around public health, around a lot of things, but people are still scratching their heads around this. I've often cited another author along with your work who I think is really important, and that's E.F. Schumacher, who famously wrote "Small is Beautiful," and this is just in the title. I think there's so much insight, because I don't know if, and people who've worked in development will always tell you this, the biggest impacts they've ever seen are at the community level. From a health systems perspective, the biggest impacts are happening at community healthcare centers when they're properly, when they have what they need to do their work, when they're enabled. I'm increasingly working in interface between culture and public health, which looks like a lot of activities that are taking place at community levels, engaging with, I mean, the most powerful ones will always have local cultural actors that are helping work on mental health, work on community engagement, but none of this can have the impact, its potential impact, when it's some group from somewhere else or some large thing. So there's this, and many of the, many of my colleagues in public health will have also seen this huge difference between headquarters and local field sites. And again, it's not anyone's fault. It's that if you want to work at such a large level as the headquarters, you have to have these extremely linear, you think that you have to have these extremely linear systems. I was speaking to someone who's currently, he's a systems engineer, and he's currently doing his master's. And so we were talking about this, and I was saying, what headquarter wants, which is you to fit into these 5-6 categories and fill in these things. It makes no sense at the field level. Everyone complains about it. It leads to wastage. It doesn't. It reduces the impact and the flexibility that you need to do something usefully. And I said, well, from a systems engineering perspective, what's the best thing? And he said, either it's this sort of extremely top-down pyramidal way, or it's something which is much more modular and node-based.
Exactly.
I think, this is reflected in nature, ecosystem.
Yes, absolutely.
What it
100%.
What it requires is giving up control to some extent.
Yes,
you have to be open.
Exactly. I mean, I would go so far as to say that control, which is the single value of the left hemisphere, and so immediately leads to prestigious pyramids with careers built on them, control is a sort of baleful necessity. It is not a good thing. It's something that one sometimes must have, but it always carries a price. It carries a price in many ways. It carries a price in alienating people from one another, and just distancing the whole attempt to understand from its roots. But it also is deadening for those who are working in the organization. And I always think that the best principle for an organization is to have a very, very light hand on the tiller and devolve down the hierarchy as far as you can enough initiative to allow people to be creative. Because I don't believe people are the terrible ciphers that they become after they've worked in the hierarchical organizations for too long. I think people are inherently imaginative and creative At least if you choose the brighter and more imaginative ones, you will have no difficulty in finding such people. And they will be able to resolve problems with much less waste, much more, I would say, probably more rapidly, actually. But the key thing is that they will be on target. And there's always this tension. I happen to be proud to be a fellow of Schumacher College in Devon, which was founded in the image of the philosophy of E.F. Schumacher. And in September, I'm talking at an event in Bristol called Local Futures, which is about how one looks at the global crisis that we have as much as possible from a local perspective. Because I believe that if we are going to survive and if we are going to find ways of sustaining any kind of civilization, it won't be the one we're in now, it'll be something rather different, but much more based on local groups of people who work together, share things, trust one another, work close to the ground, are less demanding and hubristic, and that this is the way forward.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think today, one of our strengths today is our ability to be to connect, actually, to have wide networks. This is one of the great things that technology and the internet have given us, is actually an ability to be, you and I can be having this conversation from sort of, thousands of miles apart.
Yes.
And there's increasing technology and thought around how people work in decentralized groups while communicating. I think this book that came out by David Graeber and David Wengrow, The Dawn of Everything, which speaks a lot about civilizations past, and it flips the narrative that we only have two options. Either you're a very simple hunter-gatherer society that's equal. There's a better distribution of power and all of this, but you're fundamentally limited to doing anything at scale, or you're a huge pyramidal structure. And what they showed was that actually in the deep past, there were these moments every year when needed, where entire, like, hundreds and thousands of tribes would come together, do something in a coordinated fashion, which inevitably requires some pyramidal sort of behavior for a while, to do something like the big hunt, to meet at the equinox, to do so and so, and could work in a very integrated, intelligent, coordinated, coherent fashion, and then had the wisdom to break up again. This is something until recently we haven't been able to do with the kind of society we have today, but now this is one area where technology could actually help us really well. And I think you're right. Just to link it to this other thing you were saying, because I think complexity is the word. Systems and complexity are really the key words today when we look at development and we look at complex challenges. The big ones being health, the economy, technology, the environment, and social cohesion and well-being. All of these fall within the category of complex systems, complex challenges, none of which can be understood and approached in linear reductionist ways. They have to be understood in a way which is more holistic, in a way which understands the relationships between everything, in a way that whereby you can empathize with the other, where you have space for multiple perspectives, multiple ways of knowing. E.F. Schumacher spoke about the difference between convergent and divergent problems, and I think this is another thing that really sort of resonates very nicely with your work. A convergent problem is, how do you build a bicycle? Everyone's gonna eventually, if you crunch through enough iterations, you'll get to one answer. Most of all complex challenges and most of the big global challenges today all fall in the category of divergent problems, which is ones whereby that kind of thinking, those kind of pyramidal structures and reductionist approaches can never address them, because there's no one answer. It's something you have to reason, something you have to negotiate. It's something that's done in an ecosystem. Yeah.
Yes, I really agree. But I'd also say that one of the good things is that, if you like, there's something that holds them together. The divergent doesn't mean the disruption. I'm constantly talking about this need to make the implicit unfolded and explicit, but then to re-enfold it again into a greater whole. This is David Bohm and so on. But this is a very important idea, that the further unfolding or division and divergence does nothing to fragment the unity of the overall whole. In fact, it enriches it. And I think that's good, because one of the ways we can look at the modern situation is to say we've been terribly unlucky. You know, we were doing so well, and then suddenly the seas turned out to be poisoned. And suddenly somebody told us the climate was changing. You know, all these random things happening all over the place. And what bad luck. And I want to say absolutely not. I mean, these are not unforeseen consequences of a single toxic way of thinking about what a human being is, what the world is, and how we relate. And that is, in a way, the background. That is the thing that draws together the threads. But in the tackling of them, we don't certainly want to be always applying, as you say, each problem has a different structure and needs, therefore, to be tackled in a different way.
Yes. Sorry, if I wasn't clear. The way he defines divergent problems is not problems that have just necessarily divergent solutions.
No.
But a problem like, how do you set up a good education system, is one which requires, well, there's multiple perspectives. But the other thing that he speaks about, which resonates with you, is that we also have to get out of this sort of moral relativism of everything. We have to contend, and it's a complicated thing, with the fact that there may be certain approaches that are better than others, and that there's a sort of coherent and implicate order that requires of levels and hierarchies, and some things being better than others. And this is very hard today, I think.
Yes, you're right. I suppose they're slightly different in that the hierarchy suggests a structure that can fossilize, but the need to discriminate, even the word discriminate has now become almost by definition a word we don't like, but really it just means to see the fine differences. And, you know, if we can't see the fine differences between things, we're really stuffed, because some approaches are going to be, as you say, better than others. And it's making the right decisions that we're all being prepared by our education and by our living a life to make, I hope. So, yep, no, I agree with that. You said earlier that I'd somehow, and I'm very sorry if that's the case, although the conversations do tend to freewheel around in different ways, that we'd slightly sidetracked from something you wanted to talk about. So I'm aware that you might want to go back to what that was.
Oh, no, we ended up finding our there was one additional thing I wanted to mention.
Yes.
Only if we have time for that. It was about, well, my own journey has now brought me to really being very interested in culture, both for personal reasons, because I'm so inclined, I suppose, towards arts and culture and that aspect, but also because my sense is that what a lot of the deeper shifts that we're talking about when we speak about sustainability, when we speak about, I mean, this great book of by Phil Hanlon and colleagues, which I mentioned, called The Future Public Health, speaks about what the next wave of public health look like. And they speak about something that needs to bridge not just what is true, but what is beautiful and what is good, so that bring the transcendentals into this arena, as with many other arenas. And so when we speak about, they say, you know, as public health professionals, we need to be willing to question the cultures of economism, materialism, individualism, and consumerism that might be partly related to the mental health crisis, to the obesity epidemic, to a lot of the problems that we're currently facing. What all of that brings you, again, as you go sort of lower down into the different roots of these problems, is how do we make sense of the world? And culture seems to me to be one of those sort of frameworks that brings together many of our narratives, our mythos, along with our logos, and can perhaps help us, particularly in a world where contending with things like, well, many of these transcendent things, qualities that we're speaking about, is sort of seen with a level of distaste by people. Arts and culture seems to be one way to bring people a little closer to appreciating different ways of seeing, different ways of being. So I was just curious what your thoughts are on that, really.
Very important points you raised there. Thank you. And I particularly liked your reference to values, because I think that what a culture is misunderstood. First of all, it's an organism. It grows. It can't be manufactured. It can't be machine made according to a blueprint. It grows organically out of the experiences of many lives, their insights, their suffering, their love, their approach to the world in the light of these values that matter most, which I still think are the Platonic triad of beauty, goodness, and truth, which you mentioned. And I love the fact that that book, you showed me the chapter heading where they were going to talk about the future health management in the light of these values. And I know that I was myself slightly surprised by the fact that I found that towards the very end of The Matter with Things, and having talked about things like time and space and matter and consciousness, I really homed in on values and purpose as so important. Not just important, like we must have them, but fundamental. I mean, I think they're at the ground of being. I think that consciousness intrinsically cannot not have these values. It's orientated consciousness, always. Consciousness is always of or towards something. And what, again, attracts and guides and pilots that process is the dynamism of an attraction towards certain ideals. And I think it's the loss of ideals and the loss of a sense of purpose that are causing so many of the problems of our failing civilization, because it can't last without them. Not because, as sometimes it's put, we need these things because they cheer us up or something and make it possible to get on with the grim business of life. Not at all, but because they are really the business of life. You know, there's nothing more real that you can find at the bottom of things than those ideals which come together in the holy. And it's the fact that we've utterly lost any sense of purpose or value that makes things so barren, so unproductive, so wasteful, and so productive of mental health problems, because we are not happy, fulfilled, wise, or, you know, properly human beings without those ideas. That's what I'd say about it, and I'd love to hear any reflections you have about that.
Yeah, I've also, so yeah, completely. I mean, one of the reasons that I felt validated in choosing to move towards this sort of more integral perspective with culture being at the core of my work on climate or health was the the reflection that underneath everything that I was seeing was these stories, actually, storytelling, whether often completely unconscious, you know, in different institutions, in different people, in different leaders, everyone's narrating to provide them with some sense, but the narration is often one of, so one of my friends with whom I've been speaking about your work recently is working on a campaign to stop the proliferation of these sort of AI-driven sort of killing machines, essentially, that are autonomous weapons, essentially. And the narratives that are driving a lot of that are narratives of fear, of if we don't develop this, then somebody else will. Or in other cases, you know, the sort of narratives that lead to a lot of this progress are looking at the world in an extremely, you know, fragmented manner of, you know, one large group of people versus another. But it's all a battle of narratives. It's a battle of the myths that are driving people. As I was thinking of this over the last couple of days, I was saying, well, you know, so there's no values. But then at the same time, at one level, all you hear today is conflicts of ideologies and values, except, so I struggled with this for a minute. I said, but then there's everyone's talking, on one hand, everyone's talking about values, but but what it seems to me, and tell me what you think about this, is that actually it's again looking at the values with one hemisphere, which is the external part of those values, the wrapping of the value, as opposed to the embodiment of the value, which is why you see a lot of people kind of reject a lot of values, because they say, well, you know, the people who say that they believe this are doing this, and therefore that's rubbish. And then, but what I'm seeing is that across the board, whether it's this political ideology or that sort of spiritual perspective or this sort of, you know, it's all very surface and all kind of very left hemisphere, which is why they're all falling flat.
I think you're right, and when you talk about the conflict of ideologies, what is not really being talked about is what actually is good, what actually is true, what actually is beautiful. I don't even hear people raise the question of beauty these days, haven't for about 100 years. Truth is now a laughingstock. And goodness, well, if it boils down to anything, it boils down to a utilitarian calculus, which has nothing to do, in my view, I've argued this rather forcibly in The Matter with Things, with the left hemisphere's conception of utility. So it boils down to, we think we want this, we want that, we want the other, but it's as you say, a very superficial level that in a way sounds like it's about values, but really isn't, because those values are being utterly bypassed. Nobody is really deeply examining them. And if they did, they'd find that the points of view that are in conflict would have some elements of truth on each side and some elements of goodness on each side. But the blindness of sheer dogma means that you cannot accept that what you're saying has only very partial truth or only very partial goodness, as most positions only do. If only it were easy to have the whole truth and the whole goodness, but wisdom shows us that that is never going to be our lot. We have to make do in this world with what we can get by with.
Yes, completely. The dogmatic lens on values, or the absence of values, is what makes all of it very empty. And that embodied, lived, implicit appreciation of these things is what makes all the difference. You've written about these different words for knowing in languages other than English, like so French, which I speak in Geneva, you know, we have this word connaître and savoir, and there's a big difference between the savoir of, well, I know that this value is like this, and the connaître, which is something you can only have with a living person,
Yes.
which requires an interaction and engagement, a lived experience with whatever it is. So again, the hardest thing in the world is we have to live our life, I suppose, and we have to encourage that. Which again, so to me, in a world where everything is so dogmatic, it's the experiential that needs to be encouraged today.
That's absolutely it, and it's that's being driven out of our lives as unsafe, unreliable, uncertain. But I'm afraid you can't get to first base with leading a life if you're still in fear of being wrong or not being sure. I mean, it's people who think they're never wrong and are absolutely sure about things that are the biggest worry in this world. So, yes, and I think I would go so far as to say that connector is not really just about being with a person, because I mean, of course, that is the ideal situation, but with one's experience. And we don't talk enough honestly, about what experience tells us, because we've been made to toe a kind of abstract line of a certain set of procedural things that we can say and that we can value and so forth. And that's never going to help us out of this crisis.
Yes.
Anyway.
If we other epistemologies, you would connaître everything. Nature, your own experience it's a living co-creative connected experience, and this is again what I appreciate so much about your work, is that you're providing a bridge between those different appreciations of the world. And so there's room in polite sort of rational society suddenly to talk about a broader metaphysics, a broader epistemology, which resonates with time, sort of ancient sort of wisdom from.
And even there, one can have a degree of discrimination and some things being better than others. In the book, I say, that savoir is valuable, but in the end, it has to bow to canon, to connaître, and that wissen has to bow to canon. And so, these things are never completely symmetrical in my experience. But anyway, there we are.
And
we've had a. Go on.
Oh no, it was just to say that's probably a really important point to make throughout everything we're saying, is that it's not one or the other. All these things have great value, and it's just about the balance between them.
We need them both, and we need them also sometimes to exclude one another. Yes, right. Well, thank you very much.
But
lots of time for questions.
Yes, thank you both. I really loved that you got on this connaître, savoir point, because in a way it links back to this idea of context that you were talking about at the beginning as well. And I think linguistic context is something that we haven't talked about as much on this series, and it would be a fruitful one to explore potentially in another session. But I just wanted to say thank you initially for that really meaningful conversation. And I think at this point, I'm going to offer a couple of thoughts, perhaps not as typical a question, perhaps, but rather just a few thoughts that came to me while people have a chance to reflect and write their questions into the chat. Just as a small technical reminder, if you could please put your questions into the chat as well as raise your hand. That way, Louisa and I can find you when we are moving towards individuals asking their questions on the screen. So as you guys think through your questions, I wanted to just go back to this question. I mean, the place and context part at the beginning for me felt very relevant, and it seems so clear that context can mean actually a lot of different things. And I think, Ameer, talking specifically about context in the development world might be slightly different than other contexts that we could talk about. But I'd love for you to both bring in this idea of the arts a little bit more as well, because I think that there's an overlap there with what you're talking about, and specifically arts as inherently a process and as inherently or ideally a state of flow. If you are creating something, you are in a process and you're in a state of flow in an ideal context, right? So I guess, I mean, that's just my own personal set of thoughts as someone who's worked in a variety of artistic forms as well. That's my own personal experience, is when you're in that creative mode, you enter into a state of flow. So I'm just maybe wondering if you can both touch on that a little bit more, maybe a few minutes while we wait for the questions to come through.
Well, thank you, Lee. Do you want to go ahead, Ameer?
Maybe I'll let you go ahead first, because I'm still thinking about it, actually. If that's okay.
It's a bit of an open one, right? It's not so easy.
Yes. Well, I thought it was worth raising the point that context has a very particular meaning or range of meanings, perhaps, when one's dealing in the business of international development. And that you would know more about that, possibly. The role of the arts, I think, is absolutely essential. And I'm just worried, though, that art must never be dragooned into the service of an administrative goal. Or of any other kind of a goal. It shouldn't have designs on us at all. It should be able to help us see something that otherwise we couldn't see. It needs to be self-effacing, not declarative. And the trouble nowadays is that works of art are becoming tools of propaganda. They're far too readily kind of lined up with certain points of view or social issues or whatever. And I find this depressing, destructive, and not the way art should go. So the idea of being in that flow that you describe seems to me a much better place, where you're not in your cognitive mode designing things, but are actually giving yourself up, making yourself vulnerable to the business of experience and not knowing. In fact, I believe that it's a whole other talk, isn't it? But I'm sure you'd agree with me, Ameer, from the conversations we've had, that not knowing is absolutely essential, at least as important, if not more important than knowing. But please give me some reflections of your own, if you can.
And I like that you ended on that, because one of the other things I think that we need to start to look at quite seriously is unlearning. What do we unlearn in our models and our approaches, and what can we learn? Because currently there's this, one of the conversations I've had with an artist friend from Mali, where I used to work, was a reflection he had. He's saying, man, but these guys, they come, all these different institutions, they come and they tell us to have X type of society, and now we're ourselves trying to follow this particular model. But then you find out a few years later, they're all talking about having things that we have in plenty, strong bonds, big communities, all this rich art, which and a greater sense of flow in terms of life. You're not looking at time in the same way. You're really focusing on the non-material aspects to your life. And so Mali, to me, reminded me of a lot of what you were saying, Lee, which is that so already there's it's obviously changing now, like the whole world is, but there was a much less emphasized aspect on consumerism. There's a huge depth of artistic tradition in Mali. It's one of the world's great and people from all over the world to kind of get regenerated and re-inspired with their, and as a result, I don't think it's a coincidence that there's a greater sense of flow in society, in interactions with people. And so unlearning, because there's so much knowledge that is there in all these other societies and all these other epistemologies, all these other ways of being, that perhaps we could learn a lot more from today, as opposed to asking everyone to follow the same direction where they're going to make the same mistakes and then,
Absolutely, if we could only protect them from following us. And I'm reminded of a vignette I mentioned earlier, Local Futures, which is the brainchild of Helena Norberg Hodge. And she went to Ladakh in the 1970s. And when she arrived there, she found a very peaceful community where people were working on the land. They had no pressure of time. They worked very harmoniously together, and they seemed to be happy in what they were doing. And after she'd been shown around a village and seen the houses and the way people lived, she said, "And now can you take me to where the poor people live?" And they said, "But there are no poor people. We have everything here." And she went back some 10 or 15 years later, after Western capitalism, advertising, media had broken into and disrupted this ancient way of life. And she found that they were saying, "What can you do to help us? We are so poor." And that now people were beginning to worry about their body image, harming themselves, unhappy, competitive. Anyway, that's. I just think there's so much wisdom we can learn from those cultures that we haven't already destroyed.
Yes, completely. There have been some interesting talks recently about the concept of abundance in a lot of traditional culture and South Asian culture, and I was certainly struck by that. Just Lee, to get back to your point about arts, just two other things that come to mind is one, there's been some work that I've been doing recently with some colleagues on art qualities, and I think this is one of those bridges in terms of like, how do you help instill some of these different ways of paying attention, and the arts, as you know, Lee, as someone who's also in it, they nurture so many qualities that have so much to say to other fields, engaging with paradox, engaging with multiple truths, engaging with ambiguity, understanding the overall gestalt sense of something, understanding that the music is, as Iain says, not in the C sharp or in the space in between the thing or in the silence of it's in the whole. And this concept of getting into a state of flow where you feel like you are channeling something, as opposed to which I think actually joins Ian's point of I always get it wrong, active passivity or passive activity, but in flow you get the sense that you're sort of surfing a wave as opposed to swimming, and I think that these are all really important concepts. And even in public health, we're starting to use participatory arts-based forms as ways of encouraging emergent understanding changes that you don't come with an agenda to actually discover or change, but where you just set something up, bringing people together typically in a way. The key aspect is that it builds a connection between people and that it permits emergence and flow, actually. So thank you for the question.
Wonderful to hear.
That's really good. And I'm noticing that from some of the messages in the chat, there's been a lot of interest in a few different areas that you guys have been talking about, one of which is the concept of unlearning. And it's also something that at Perspectiva we're also thinking a lot about in the context of our education work. and how to get people into an environment where they can effectively unlearn certain things. So I just wanted to quickly ask Rachel Leeds to come on and ask her question related to unlearning. I think she was looking maybe for some specific resources or texts or any context, perhaps, for further thoughts on unlearning. So I don't know if Rachel, we can find you here and unmute you. Louisa, I think, is looking for her right now. I think so, yes.
Great. Yeah, not much more to add to that. Just really deep appreciation for the conversation, and this idea of unlearning is something that I've been thinking a lot about and grappling with at the organizational level as well. Sort of how do we, especially when you think about organizational change, go about that process of unlearning a lot of the systems and processes and behaviors that have been perpetuating some of these more problematic patterns that we see. So would love any additional resources or thoughts that you have on that. Thank you so much.
Well, if I may respond initially at any rate, I think it's, as you say, it's a very important point. And I've been thinking about how many insights that have really changed a subject area have come from somebody who approached it afresh without the usual background. And I think that, you know, having the usual background is sometimes a great help and sometimes a great hindrance. And I'm trying to think now of who the physicist is that I do quote in The Matter of Things, but he was saying, you know, the great thing is to move from your own field to another field and see what you see there and talk to the people who are in it. And this is another argument for not being too siloed, too specialized in the way in which you think, because it will become, you know, sclerotic. And insights often come from people working on the margins of a field. I've seen that very, very often in neuroscience and other areas, that people doing rather original pieces of research come up with fascinating new insights that wouldn't have been easy to come to from the more conventional path. So that's really what I would say, is that part of my general drive is to try and break down the walls of the silos and have conversations going on between specialities. We need specialties, of course, and above all nowadays, when so much is known in every area, it's hard to move outside, but it still very, very definitely needs to happen so that people can see the overall picture as well as the small picture.
Thank you, Iain. I think we'll just in an effort to try to get as many questions as possible answered. I'm going to ask, let's see, sorry, I've just lost Alan. Is it Alan who has the question? Yeah, Alan Roosh, do you have?
Yes, I am.
Okay, great.
I'm looking for my, yes.
You had a question about sense making that I wanted to see whether you could pose that to our guests.
Yes. Many times we speak about sense making, but very few times we effectively incorporate in our policy making, with making capital letters. And making sense of what is emerging is, I believe, one of the first priority of the moment. And precisely, I consider that artists can help us in becoming aware of the futures that are unfolding in front of us. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to hand that one over to you, Ameer, because it's more your area, I think. But I just wanted to say, if I may, I got so into the idea of being an outsider to a field as a way of sort of not learning. But unlearning is also possible, even if you are in the field. And I just wanted to relay a piece of wisdom that my tutor at Oxford gave me, which was always to look at the received truth and invert it, and see what argument could be made for the exact opposite of the received truth. I found this absolutely, indispensable, and often brings up insights, because the current way of looking at it just stops you seeing all kinds of things. So I was just going to say, one way of unlearning is to invert all the things that you thought you knew. Now, over to you on the policy making, because I'm sure you have things to say, Ameer. Yes.
The other aspect of unlearning, though, I think is also the experience, though, because I've seen this huge difference in when you go and you actually live somewhere different, spend time in a completely different setting, or doing something completely. Yes. You'll revisit and question everything. That experiential bit, as well as just the sort of, but and that's linked to Alain's question, because I think a lot of it's very nice to hear what you're saying, and there are now growing communities of practice of people who would like nothing more than to have artists at the table along with other decision makers and other thinkers. They do often have that insight and that vision, and there's been a struggle to get it even to articulate in a language that makes certain decision makers even understand that there's this value. But then there are some interesting efforts, increasingly now, whether it's in public health or whether it's in other aspects of development, usually in very small scales, at municipal level and at sort of NGO level. People are bringing artists in to talk about things which are not directly related to just their art, but asking them, well, as someone who by definition is thinking slightly differently and has been exercising your muscles of insight and intuition and imagination, what do you think? But this is still very, very very affected by a certain dogmatic way of thinking, a way of thinking particularly at the levels of a lot of decision making, which is still very cost-benefit, quantitative focused, and it requires better articulations, which are taking place in certain areas now, but it's a very nascent thing. So there's a movement in Europe, for example, called Culture Action Europe, which are trying to influence the role of culture in policy across the board, and there's the Community Arts Network, which are also based in Europe, but have an international network of people who are also trying to bridge that gap between implementing policy, funding, and artists, and so it's still a struggle. There's a lot of work to articulate, to raise awareness of this, yeah, but it's very important, as you say.
I don't want to take up more time, but I just feel impelled to just draw attention to a possible dark side to what you're talking about, which is the sort of colonialization of art by science. So now, if you're at the top of your game as a scientist, one thing you can do to sort of differentiate yourself from your colleagues is to take an interest in art. It's become a rather sexy thing for scientists to do. And they collaborate with an artist. And equally, artists are falling over one another to collaborate with a scientist. I feel that there's something unhealthy in this relationship because it's a bit one way. The cachet of science is delivered to the arts. And it seems to me rather like the bad old days of colonialism, when to take somebody seriously, they had to dress like the British in order to be taken seriously. And I feel that artists now feel that they've got to do some collaboration or installation involving science in order to sort of score properly. But I don't believe good art needs that at all, although it can be helpful and fruitful. I'm not against it. I'm just saying there's a potential dark side.
Yeah, again, it's not a what, it's a how, right?
So no, it's a how. Yes,
but I
exactly.
think that's really important, because, and something to mention about art, I'm glad you brought that up actually, is that it's been used for propaganda. It's been used for pure, facile, trite entertainment with no substance. and it can be another portal to the truth, to an aspect of the truth. It can help us have visions of futures and so on. And so it's that how, whether it is balanced with the good and the true, as well, and it's not a sort of fetishized or sort of idolized kind of version of the arts, but something where you're actually, so that's a good point.
And that actually makes me think to the earlier point that you were making about storytelling. And I have this particular issue with storytelling as it is sometimes twisted into ways that are not so healthy and serve propagandistic purposes, for example. So again, it's the question of how. So from there, that's my own little aside, I did want to ask Esther to come in. She had this question about effective altruism a while ago that several people were also curious about. So Esther, if you wouldn't mind unmuting yourself, and we'll pin you here.
I have unmuted. Thank you for messaging me beforehand. That was nice. So I keep on encountering this thing called effective altruism, where basically it's your moral imperative to calculate the way you can save the most human lives and then do that. So this feels very, well, it's nice that they have a purpose, but the way they go about it seems very, very wrong to me. So I think you probably have some interesting things to say about that. So over to you.
Yes, okay. Well, I've written about this, I think, quite a lot, so I won't take up too much time. But it's the result of the left hemisphere's privileging of outcomes over intentions. Morality is a matter of how you dispose your consciousness. It's the intention behind an action that governs whether it's a moral one or not. A good action can come from even an evil intention if it's purely a matter of calculation. And it's a difficult area because obviously you want good things to happen, and that has to be taken into account. But I think that this reductive way of totting things up and making a sum out of it is absurd. Morality can't be like this. When one makes decisions in life, one's not trying to sum, well, is it, if I make one person unhappy by this choice and two other people are going to be happy, but one of them is a child, and if I did the other thing, you can't do this. You've got to cut free of this and think, what is the moral action here? What is it that a good person would do? And try to be true to that. That's really all I'd say.
Perhaps we can go, and I would say just to Esther and all the others who are asking about effective altruism, you can look, I believe, Iain, you have writing on your website about this and elsewhere. So if you're curious, you can go and search for some of those. All right, so our next person we wanted to bring in was Kevin. And let's just see if we can find him here. Kevin, are you able to unmute yourself? He has perhaps left the call since.
No, I'm here. That's fine. I'm sorry.
There's a bit of background noise, but we'll see if we can hear.
Yeah. So I'm really interested in filmmaking and storytelling. So I was wondering, not in a utilitarian way, but more of maybe just a thematic way, how filmmaking and storytelling can help transform the culture.
So visual storytelling and how film might be involved in what we're talking about.
Well, shall I just dive in? I think that we've agreed, and I would very much emphasize that we understand ourselves through the stories that we tell as a culture, and that the deep things in life cannot be conveyed literally in open serial analytic discourse, but rely on the use of myths, of metaphors, of drama, of poetry, of art of all kinds, music and so forth, to convey their meaning. And so, yes, I mean, visual arts are enormously powerful, and the stories that are told in them, even if they're not conventional stories, contain irresistible wisdom. One of the insights I got from reading about early Greek philosophy was that actually, in some ways, the drama of Aeschylus, Euripides, and so on was as important in terms of understanding the world as anything in Plato or Aristotle. And that drama, as in Shakespeare, can be inexhaustibly rich. And when I think of filmmaking and its ability to convey deep, life-changing myths, I think, I'm afraid, always of Andrei Tarkovsky, who to me is the greatest filmmaker that ever lived, and these remarkable myths and stories that he tells. But anything that you would want to say, Ameer?
I think you did a great job, obviously, with that. I've heard you mention some of these things before and completely align with them. Two things just came to mind. One was, to integrate your previous point, Iain, in this question about, intention, because filmmaking is equally used, as we know, for everything on social media and with the nefarious purposes as well, and propaganda.
Yes.
That checking one's intentions are so important, can't be overlooked, really. And the other aspect I'll say is, obviously filmmaking is today like the primary way that people engage with a form of art, I'd say, almost, right? The visual, the audio visual. One thing I noticed, a lot of the practices that I'm encountering and engaging with involve theater. And there is a certain power to the simplicity of theater, whereby, because there's less action and perfect scenes, and like they haven't filled in all the gaps, you end up having to do a lot of your own work by engaging with the actors and sort of putting something of your own imagination into what you're seeing. And I feel like that's one of the reasons that theater is so powerful, is that it's a process of engagement between the audience and the actors. My father is a huge film fan, and he often speaks about how some of the older directors and some of the older films, especially a lot of the black and white ones, because they had less access to sort of fancy computer graphics and all of this, they really focused a lot on presenting the drama through the interaction, but there was essentially a lot of simplicity there, and a lot of use of theatrical methods and understanding. And so I'm just putting it out there that it might be important for us to remember some of what makes good filming really powerful, which is a lot of the simple elements, as opposed to a lot of the fancy things that we have at our disposal today, and encourage that interaction with it.
Yeah.
That's great. We only have a few minutes left, but there's been one of the participants who's been particularly keen to ask her question. So I wanted to ask Rania to come on, and if we could try to just keep it to a very short answer if possible. And I mean, I believe it's a question that's going to require an hour to discuss potentially, but just to put it out there for people to mull upon as they go about the rest of their day or evening. So Rania, if you wouldn't mind turning your camera on, and Louisa, unmuting yourself Perfect. Okay.
All right. Well, yes. I think predominantly to Iain as a psychiatrist, do you see the correlating parallels and hence the value therein when considering how to respond between the mechanistic systems and, if brought to a micro level, the nature of people on the cluster B spectrum? And I guess more accurately belonging to the so-called dark triad, you know, narcissism and psychopathy being involved.
Yes.
And even more accurately, I'd say the malignant covert narcissists, many of whom today function under the guise of promoting understanding, complexity, and interconnectedness,
Yes.
and so on, because the nature of the covert narc is to be an imposter of sorts. Because I think when you do, you also understand the dynamics of the societal systems that, as you say, involve people who are not deliberately imposing the compartmentalization, but find themselves to be part of it nevertheless. And many times
Yes.
even oblivious to it, you know. But the parallels here is to consider the dynamics of that which happens on the individual or group level, where the highly narcissistic person functions by an entire dynamics involving enablers, you know, whether conscious or oblivious to that, to being that. So, yeah.
Well, thank you. Yes, I'll try and be enormously brief. For those who don't know this, cloning a grouped personality types and personality disorders in 3 groups. Cluster B consists of histrionic, narcissistic, and psychopathic, as well as probably borderline personalities, who can be enormously manipulative and deceptive. And I think what is being got at is that these people play an undue role in forming our society. They are in effect predators, and they tend to prey on individuals from other categories like cluster C, but we won't go into all of that. I think the point is that you're absolutely right, that there are far too many such people in positions of power today, perhaps always have been, and that's one of the problems about having systems of power. But we can't trust them to mold our future, and they will always present something which is a disaster as something for our benefit. So perhaps we ought to just leave it at that, unless you have something to add, Ameer. No, okay.
So Ameer, I just wanted to give you a chance to be able to say maybe any last thoughts or reflections before we finish up for the evening. And perhaps, so to give Ameer perhaps the last word, which I think is a nice practice. I wanted to remind everyone, thank you first of all, everyone, for coming, but also for your patience, those of you who are waiting for questions. There's just only so much we can get through in a 40-minute, 30-minute question period. And so I'll leave it at that, and maybe a small reminder that next Thursday evening, if you do have more questions, you can bring them to our connections and inquiry sessions, which we're still running every other week. And next Thursday, Michael and I will be putting together a program that will allow you to talk more about the specific content that we discussed tonight. So feel free to sign on for that. It'll be in the email that will come out when we send out the link to this recording. But Ameer, please, if you have any last words, I would love to leave the space to you.
Oh gosh, I really
a lot of pressure. No.
I have very little left to say. I just really want to thank you all for this opportunity. I want to thank Iain above all for his work, because it's had such a huge impact on me and on several colleagues that I know in this. I think it's hopefully these kind of discussions that'll help us have better navigation, orientation through these very complex challenges and complex times. And so just thank you very much. One of the images that I get in my mind, I don't know if it resonates with you at all, Iain, about these different ways of approach, is like if you're walking down a path, a dark path at night, and there's lots of obstacles and things. You've got two different ways at your disposal. One of them is like a virtual reality set that you can put on your eyes, and it's got really good like calculation, mapping. It can give you an assumption-based map right through the forest and all your obstacles, but it's not based at all on what's there. It's just based on what you fed inside it, but it can go very far. And then the other thing is you have a candle, you know, that you sort of open up your eyes and you can see, but by definition, you won't be able to see very far, but you'll be able to see a little more truly. And it's something that sort of came up as I was thinking about some of your work, and it's just an image that came up again right now.
Oh, well, thank you, Ameer, and thank you for all that you've brought to this evening, and your experience and wisdom. Thank you very much. And I'm sure, as usual, that the chat will be saved, and so I'll get to read it. I never have time during the actual podcast, so there we are.
We'll send it to you, Iain. Thank you to everyone, and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.